Hello and good morning. I'm Morgan Donner, and today I wanted to talk to you about how I made these shoes. So I have made a couple of shoes before with the help of the book Stepping Through Time, a classic for medieval shoemaking, and through one of the best websites that's out there for information on late 16th century shoes, raisedheels.com. I've learned a lot from that page, and recently the maker hosted a workshop that I was very fortunate to attend. I had early 14th century shoes in mind, so he went ahead and prepared the pattern based on my foot measurements that I sent in. That way we wouldn't need to spend any time at the workshop itself getting all that figured out. But the basic method is that using my footprint and my measurements around the foot, he selected a last that most resembled my own measurements. Tiny quick aside here, usually he does workshops with modern shoe lasts, but I happen to be quite close to a pair of reproduction medieval wooden lasts that he had in his collection. So he asked if I might be interested in possibly using those, even though they are not a kind of conventional modern shape that we might be a little bit more used to. But my answer was, of course, a very enthusiastic yes. Anywho, with the last selected, he made a paper pattern that fit around the last nicely and then cut that pattern out of leather. To prepare the pieces for sewing, I conditioned each of the leather pieces with tallow. There are many intricate patterns to choose from based on the extant examples available, but I decided to go for a fairly simple design. To stitch the upper pieces together, we first need to prepare the thread and needle. Instead of a metal modern needle, we're using a bristle hair from a boar. If you've never held one of these before, they're about the same thickness as a cat's whisker and has a sort of similar springy quality to it. Unlike a whisker though, they end in several splits, and we need those for turning this into a leather needle today. Start out with 16 weight linen, single ply. The single ply is recommended because you can untwist it and break the thread really easily and get these nice wispy ends. A multi-ply will be a little bit harder to break and won't as easily create the ends that we need. Pull 3 threads, each of them about 3 yards or meters long, and then slightly stagger them together. The first thread should be the one with a good long wispy end, sometimes referred to as a taw. Go ahead and wax these together. Grab the boar bristle and split it down about 2/3 of the way. Wax these split ends and then re-split them apart. Lay the long, thin, wispy end of the thread at the base of the split. Close the split bristle halves, kind of lightly trapping that end of the thread. Wind the thread by twisting the bristle, first going up towards the point and then back down over itself. Try to keep the thread perfectly side by side, neither winding it back over itself nor leaving big spaces between each twist around the bristle. Once you've incorporated all 3 ends of the thread, hold the thread and one end of the split bristle hair and twist them together. Then grab the other leg of the split and twist with your other hand, creating a little series of X's around the thread. Lock all of this in place by piercing near one of the X's and thread the needle end of the bristle through the hole. If you like, you can do this a couple times. Wax this whole area and then down the length of the thread, but leave the last few inches unwaxed so that you can carefully break and stagger the threads. Repeat the process on this end with another bristle. Roll the thread on your thigh to give it a good twist and wax the whole thing. At this point, you might be asking why I'm not just using a leatherworking needle instead of all this business. There's two reasons. First being that sometimes it's just fun to learn the historical practice version of a craft, and secondly being entirely practical. Threading on a modern needle results in a suddenly bulky spot where the thread starts. This is a little bit harder to sew through leather, especially with thick threads and very thick leather, which is used in the stitching of the sole later on. The profile of the bristle to thread is a lot smoother, and you don't have this unnecessarily double thread spot making things difficult. To stitch the leather pieces together, I'm using a stirrup strap, which is not unlike a very long, slim belt. It goes around the foot and knee, just tight enough to hold the project in place when you lightly press down with your foot, and enough slack that you can lift your foot to release tension. This leaves my hands free to work on stitching. To sew the upper, we're going to use an edge flesh seam. With an awl, I pierce through the inside of the leather, the flesh side, and travel the awl through at an angle so that I come out through the side of the leather, the edge. Then I go through the opposite side the same way, in through the edge and then angle up. If I do my stitches correctly, then you will not see any of the white thread on the outside of the seam. And of course, you can totally see here that I did in fact miss the mark on one of these stitches. But it's not really a big deal. I just simply removed those stitches and sewed it back up again. Once you've made a path for the thread to go, insert both boar bristle needles through the holes, pull one side gently through, being careful to not accidentally pull the bristle off of the linen thread. When you have one side safely through, several inches past the first bristle, go ahead and grab both the thread and the tip of the second bristle and pull them together. Pulling that first thread back a bit helps feed the second bristle through until you can safely pull on both threads with no danger of pulling the bristle out. Before you tighten the stitch completely, go ahead and loop one end through the stitch, creating a half knot inside the seam itself. When you hit the end of a seam, go backwards through your previous stitches, creating a sort of back stitch, and then cut off the excess thread. The beginning of each seam works exactly the same way. You start a little bit away from the edge and then back stitch towards the edge 1 or 2 stitches before continuing the rest of the seam. The uppers of both shoes are done, so they are now being put into a bucket of water to soak while we go ahead and prepare the sole. Meanwhile, I had the opportunity to use one of the fancy round knives to cut out the sole. These are very, very cool, and I absolutely need one of these for my sewing room immediately. Would it get very much use there? No, but it is very badass, right? Anyways, the sole is cut to the same shape as the bottom of the last and then temporarily nailed in place. The soaked upper is then placed on the last grain side down, and a strip of leather gets added in there to become a welt. To keep the upper from shifting around on me, I've tacked in some nails at the toe and heel to help hold it down. Same goes for the narrow section under the sole, called the waist. I loosely stitched that together to help secure the upper. The stitching thread for the sole is made the same way as the upper, but with 7 threads instead of just 3. It needs to be much stronger. Stitch the upper, welt, and sole together and get comfortable because this takes like about 8 hours of Disney soundtracks to complete, which is approximately 120 songs that I could not include in this video because, copyright stuff. But rest assured, there was definitely a lot of sing-along energy at this workshop. With my stitching done, I took out the temporary nails and then removed the extra leather from the upper, creating a nice and flat bottom for the shoe. Hammering that seam with a planishing hammer helps flatten it even further and smooth down the roughest edges of the seam. This is a turn shoe, which means that it is currently inside out and we need to flip the whole thing right side out. We need to turn the shoe. It goes into a bucket of water again to soften the leather and make it pliable enough to flip. While that soaks, I made a pair of toggles. Okay, turn shoe time. This is always an adventure. I put it back on the last once it was right side out and let it dry there for a couple of days. I didn't get any footage of the very last step here, but I just pierced the strap ends and the tongue top area for the toggle and done. So this project was a lot of fun. It was definitely a very different experience getting to make something with the sort of instant and continuous feedback of someone who is familiar and quite knowledgeable about the subject, in this case, making shoes. It was very different than my usual MO, which is to read up as much as I can on a subject and fill in the blanks where I can when it doesn't quite address my specific project's needs, which works, but it was very, very nice to have an actual like knowledgeable person nearby to help out. So you should definitely check out his website, raisedheels.com, if you want to check out more, much more complex shoes than what I showed here today. And if you're maybe interested in some more leatherworking projects, I did make this leather case, this medieval style leather case, a couple months back, and I think it's very cool, and I think you might too. So go give that a gander, and you guys have a great day.